Hello everyone, I am the Meta Kirby, and welcome to my channel, The Commander Tavern. The Commander Tavern is a channel dedicated to my favorite Magic the Gathering format. The Brewery is a series on this channel showcasing my spicy brews and other deck techs. On this episode of The Brewery, I will be discussing my take on a commander from Brothers War, Urza, Prince of Kroog. If you like this deck or any of the cards I'll be mentioning throughout the video, please consider using my TCG Player affiliate link when purchasing those cards. You can find that link down in the description. It'll really help out the channel. But the very best way you can help support the channel is with my Patreon. There are plenty of perks for being a patron, such as early access to certain videos, exclusive deck techs, gifts, and more. You can also support my channel for free by simply liking, subscribing, and sharing, which also helps out a lot. I put out a video every Monday, so you don't want to miss out. You can join my Discord server for free if you want to join the Commander Tavern community. All pertinent links are down in the description. Alright, let's get back to the episode. Urza is a 2/3 human artificer for 2 generic, 1 white, and 1 blue. He has a static ability that pumps all your artifact creatures +2/+2. While that in and of itself is useful, it synergizes with his activated ability. For 6 generic, you create a token copy of an artifact you control, except it's a 1/1 soldier creature in addition to its other types. This ability is quite strong to say the least. It is quite costly to activate, but that isn't really a problem in this deck, which we'll soon see. That being said, this combination of abilities allows you to both combo off with Urza and then finish off the board with an insane army of soldiers. That's because while their base power and toughness is 1/1, as long as Urza is on the battlefield, they are 3/3s, which is something to scoff at. They can chump block and take pings well before dying, so that's good. Before I go over the myriad of ways the deck can go infinite, as well as how we use that infinity to our advantage, I want to go over the best card in the deck, Hearthstone. This artifact reduces the activated costs of creatures by 1. Unfortunately, it's a symmetric effect, so it might benefit opponents, so be wary of opponents' boards when playing it. However, with Urza, it's absolutely busted. Since you're able to copy it, with each copy it becomes increasingly easier to make more copies. The first copy costs 6 to get, the second 5 to get, the third 4th to get, etc. All the way until you're able to reduce Urza's activated ability to just 1 generic mana, and then things get very busted. Even without going to infinity, while this card is so busted here, I'm not running any tutors in the deck for it, but that's just a personal preference. You can if you wanted to. That being said, I am running Inventor's Fair because it doesn't take up a slot in the deck for being a mana generating land. While Hearthstone is definitely target number 1 for the Fair is still useful as getting any key artifact, including artifact creatures, from the deck. So even if you're also against running tutors, you do well by including this one. That's how good Hearthstone is here. Just imagine being able to copy Nettle Cyst or Kappa Cannoneer for just 1 generic mana each time. These artifacts are already busted as it is, but creating multiples of them just pump each other up. The Cannoneer will already be a win con if your creatures gain haste, which they will, since it becomes unblockable. So even if you're not creating infinitely many of them, they will close out games. The best thing about these effects is that they don't go away at the end of the turn. The pump by the equipment is static and the Kappa gets +1/+1 counters. Super busted. Rogue's Passage is included as a way to make either the creature equipped by Nettle Cyst unblockable or any other significantly large creature in the deck, since there are a couple of ways of creating this construct token, which has essentially the same effect as the creature equipped with Nettle Cyst. This is why the deck isn't just combo but beatdown too. Urza Saga, the only other tutor in the deck, just like the Inventor's Fair, is on a mana generating land, so it doesn't take up a slot in the deck. With this saga, you have the potential of creating 2 of those tokens before it's sacrificed after completing its final lore, which can then be used to get any of the deck's 1-costed artifacts. As for how we can potentially go infinite, we just need to lower Urza's activated abilities cost. Once we do, then any of the deck's mana rocks that can tap for more than 1 mana, like Coveted Jewel, Gilded Lotus, Thran Dynamo, Mana Vault, or Soul Ring, will get the job done. Keep in mind that the token copies created are 1/1 creatures, meaning that they'll have Summoning Sickness. So even if any of these on their own is enough to activate Urza, you can't keep tapping the new token down to create more of them unless they gain haste, which again, they will. That being said, with the exception of Soul Ring, these tap down for 3 mana, so 2 of them are enough to get another copy of either of the ones tapped down if Urza's ability cost isn't reduced. Thanks to Urza Saga, we can get either Mana Vault or Soul Ring straight to the battlefield, which is pretty good. A bonus for copying Coveted Jewel is that you get to draw 3 cards each time you do, which is absolutely amazing, making it one of the best mana rocks in the deck. However, the absolute best mana rock in the deck is Power Stone Shard, which is also quite flavorful. While it only taps for 1 colorless at first, once you start copying it, you'll be able to generate exponential amounts of mana. That's because after the first iteration, each shard will tap for 2 colorless mana for a total of 4, then each of those will tap for 3 mana for a total of 9. These things get out of hand very quickly. especially if we're achieving it multiple times per activation, thanks to cards like Illusionist, Bracers, and Anointed Procession. Let's say we did tap down 2 mana rocks that add 3 mana, like Thran Dynamo and Gilded Lotus. If Urza is equipped with the Bracers, he's going to create 2 copies of either of these mana rocks we tap down to pay for his ability. Thanks to that, we can keep tapping them down for 6 more mana to keep going. Or if we had the enchantment in play, we'd also be creating twice as many tokens. Bonus points for having both of them, since then you'd be creating a total of 4 token copies after the stack resolves. Unwinding Clock also helps us activate Urza multiple times in a single turn around the table, since it untaps all of our artifacts each untap step. This helps us not only free up our mana rocks to keep sinking into Prince of Kroog to get even more mana rocks, or whatever key artifact we're copying, but it'll also untap any artifact creatures we tapped to attack with. This gives them pseudo-vigilance, making the clock much better than at first glance, especially thanks to Liberator, Urza's Battlethopter, and Vedalken Orrery being in the deck. Thanks to Unwinding Clock untapping all of our artifacts each untap step, we can play all of our artifact spells at the end of our opponent's end steps or in response to whatever we need to do, which is even better since a lot of the deck's interaction is artifact based. The Battlethopter is pretty good too, since you can use it to attack since it has flying and can potentially get bigger with each spell you cast. That being said, do pay attention to that trigger. If you're reducing the cost of your spells, they might not trigger it. It's still a good card to include though in the deck anyways, if we are reducing casting costs, which we'll see later. However, again, while we're able to potentially activate Prince of Kroog multiple times in a turn, we can't necessarily go infinite without a little help from things like Akroma's Memorial and Thousand Year Elixir. While the Elixir doesn't give haste per se, meaning that you can't use it to attack with creatures that have Summoning Sickness, you can still use it so that those 1/1 soldier mana rocks can tap down for mana, helping to create more and more copies of themselves. Now, the Memorial can also help with that regard, but its other boons are absolutely busted in the deck. Those artifact creatures are not only getting +2/+2 from Urza, but also a very beefy keyword soup from the Memorial. So if you're at the point where you're creating an army of artifact creatures, you can send them all across the board for quite the alpha strike, even if you haven't reached infinity yet. As for getting there, reducing Urza's activated abilities cost low enough with hasty mana rocks is one way, but you can also tap down those artifacts for mana thanks to Urza Lord High Artificer, regardless if they had Summoning Sickness or not, because the activated ability is on Urza himself. So if you were able to get Prince of Kroog's activated ability cost down to just 1 generic mana, tapping down the copied artifact is enough to keep paying for that cost, creating infinitely many artifacts which would then be pumping any Nettlecyst equipped creature, Kappa Cannoneer, or the construct token previously mentioned, a token created by Urza himself. Granted, this Urza is quite pricey on the secondary market, but he does a ton of work here, and that's without even taking his second activated ability into consideration, which is an outlet for infinite mana. However, when playtesting the deck, I didn't really activate him for that, since there are enough interaction instants that I didn't want to end up exiling them. Quark Clan Ironworks is another way of achieving infinity regardless of Summoning Sickness. That's because you can just sacrifice the newly created artifact copy to it in order to add 2 colorless mana to your mana pool, mana that can then be sunk right back into Prince of Kroog to help keep the engine going. While this won't necessarily help boost Nettlecyst or the construct tokens, it'll still pump any Kappa Cannoneers you might have. While it might seem like you're sitting around waiting until you're able to activate Urza as many times as possible, which would require either a hefty investment in mana or finally getting Hearthstone, the deck is mostly artifacts. So being able to reduce the cost of most of the deck's spells help us to vomit out our hand and quickly take over the board, or have enough mana left over to slowly but surely sink into Urza. Ethereum Sculptor, Foundry Inspector, Joyous Familiar, Cloud Key, Urza Lord Protector, and Stone Calendar do just that. The first two only reduce the cost of artifact spells, and so will Cloud Key, but you have to choose artifact as it enters the battlefield. Joyous Familiar will also reduce the cost of legendary spells in the deck that aren't artifacts, which is quite helpful. Urza helping reduce the cost of instants and sorceries is also quite helpful at reducing the cost of the deck's interaction, counterspells, and recovery spells. Stone Calendar is absolutely busted since it reduces the cost of all of our spells, and since all of these except Urza are non-legendary artifacts, copying them with Prince of Kroog will really help us save mana. In fact, doing it enough times can potentially make all of our colorless artifacts cost 0. Super busted. As for Lord Protector, the deck is also running the Mightstone and Weakstone. Unfortunately, this mana rock is legendary, so we can't copy it indefinitely many times with Prince of Kroog, since state-based actions are checked before we get priority again. So we can't even tap it down for mana before it gets sent to the graveyard. That being said, if we do copy it, we still get its enter the battlefield trigger, so we can potentially kill any indestructible creature with toughness less than 5 or more if we copy it multiple times, or more importantly, draw 2 cards if there isn't any creature that needs getting rid of. but more on card advantage and interaction later on in the video. The key thing is that while this artifact is amazing on its own, as well as Urza Lord Protector being amazing in the deck on his own, for 7 generic mana they can meld into Urza Planeswalker, and with how the deck is built, you might not even need 7 mana to meld them if you have multiples of Hearthstone in play before then. In any case, once you do have this Urza, you can activate his first loyalty ability twice to reduce the cost of artifacts, instants, and sorceries by a total of 4 generic mana. Super busted. However, you can still mix and match between all of his abilities. With his +1 loyalty ability, you can loot with a net gain of 1 card. With his 0 loyalty ability, you can create 2 more 1/1 soldier artifact creature tokens, which synergizes amazingly with the deck as well. His -3 loyalty ability is amazing interaction since it can exile any non-land permanent. His ultimate is absolutely busted here, since it protects himself and our artifacts, which is most of our deck, from his own board wipe, which is even better for us since it clears the way for all of our beaters to go through and smash face. Urza Planeswalker does work in this deck. Speaking of protection, the deck is running Darksteel Forge to protect our artifacts from targeted removal, as well as mass removal like an overloaded Vandal Blast. However, if our artifact creatures are also indestructible, then we can swing out each turn since we don't have to worry about them dying from blockers. Likewise, we'll have a wall of indestructible blockers until we're able to overwhelm the board. Thanks to Mycosynth Lattice, we can also protect our entire board since all permanents are artifacts in addition to their other types. But the Lattice isn't included solely because of Darksteel Forge. While there are very few non-artifact permanents in the deck, turning all of our permanents into artifacts means that Urza, Prince of Kroog, would be able to create a token copy of any of our permanents, even lands if we wanted to. That's also why Liquid Metal Torque is included in the deck. Not only is it an amazing mana rock for costing only 2 mana to cast, but we can also tap it down to turn any permanent into an artifact and then copy it with Urza. Super good. Again, not many non-artifact permanents in the deck, but imagine being able to turn Anointed Procession into an artifact so as to copy it with Urza. The maths involved are insane. In fact, let me give a small demonstration. Suppose we did start with just 1 copy of Anointed Procession that we turn into an artifact with either the Lattice or to Torque. If we copied it with Urza, we'd get 2 copies of it. Now it doesn't even matter if the original wasn't an artifact anymore, we can copy any of the tokens since they are artifacts. If we were to copy it just one more time, we'd create 8 more token copies of it, for a total of 10 token copies, plus the original, making 11 total token doubling effects. Now doing it once more would give us 2 to the 11 more copies, which is 2,048 more, totaling 2,058 tokens plus the original. While the pattern should be clear, if you were to do it once more, because maybe you had the mana thanks to Urza's ability only costing 1 generic to activate, you'd get a whopping 2 to the 2,059 more copies. That number is 621 digits long. Suffice it to say that if your creatures had haste, this might be enough to win the game. Back to the topic of protection, the deck is running Crypto Thrall, Leonin Abunis, and Padim Console of Innovation to give all of our artifacts hexproof. Well, Crypto Thrall only gives hexproof to our other artifact creatures, but copying it just once with Urza will have them give each other hexproof, which is a good way of giving hexproof to all of our artifact creatures. While the other 2 aren't artifacts themselves, if they were to become artifacts like with the previously mentioned effects, they would protect themselves as well as the board. They're too good not to include here. Bronze Guardian is also included since it gives all of our artifacts Ward 2. Granted, Ward 2 might not be that good in a commander game since we're all about generating tons of mana after a certain point onwards. So if someone really wanted to snipe our artifacts, they could. But keep in mind that being an artifact means that we can copy it with Urza, each copy making our artifacts even more expensive to target. However, the ward effect is just a bonus. The previous 3 cards are enough global protection along with Darksteel Forge. But notice its power. Its power is the same as the number of artifacts we control. Not only is this thing going to be huge, but it also has double strike. So this is yet another game-ending beater like the ones mentioned in the beginning of the video. But even if an opponent were able to cast an overloaded Vandal Blast, Bane of Progress, etc. when we didn't have our protective effects, Fierce Guardianship, Pact of Negation, Swan Song, and Offer You Can't Refuse, Mana Drain, and Counterspell are still included. While the deck has plenty of synergistic protective effects, you can't go wrong with non-synergistic interaction like this. When brewing decks, it's important to understand their weakness and include effects accordingly. Keep in mind that the deck is also creating a ton of tokens, so mass artifact hate isn't the only thing to set us back. Mass bounce effects will too. They laugh in the face of Hexproof, Shroud, and Indestructible. A well-timed counterspell resolves that. And if the spell in question is uncounterable, Teferi's Protection gets the job done. While the deck is mostly artifacts, being white-blue means being able to include the best white and blue interaction along with the previously mentioned suite of hexproof effects. On that note, Champion's Helm and Swiftfoot Boots are included to protect our commander who is, unlike his brother, a flesh and blood human. He gets no such protection from artifact synergies, but since the deck isn't 100% dependent on him, these two equipment along with the previously shown interactive instance should be enough to protect him should it come down to it. Now if we did get our board wiped, it's quite the feel bad for sure, since we'll lose all of our tokens. But Brilliant Restoration and Triumphant Reckoning can help reanimate all of our artifacts in the graveyard. Granted, they're a bit pricey to cast, but recall that the deck does have ways to reduce the cost of instants and sorceries too. Having any of these in hand after a board wipe is quite the spectacular feeling. Academy Ruins can also help us recover artifacts, albeit one at a time. While the artifact is top decked, since we can activate this at instant speed, we can just do it in response to drawing a card. We do lose a bit of tempo there, but the card doesn't take up a slot in the deck, so it's a good trade if you ask me. Mistveiled Plains and Mystic Sanctuary also don't take up slots in the deck and are slightly better since they can be fetched for thanks to their subtypes. While the Plains will bottom deck the card, it's not that bad if we can eventually tutor for it or draw into it after shuffling the library with any fetch lands. The Sanctuary will top deck the instant or sorcery, which is great at getting back any counterspell we might need. Karn the Great Created will help us recover any artifacts from exile, which is amazing since all of the previously mentioned effects only recover them from the graveyard. Unfortunately, that's all we can do since witch effects don't work in Commander games. Bummer. In any case, Karn's static ability is quite impressive in Commander, especially against non-green decks. However, in this deck potentially more so thanks to Mycosynth Lattice. While these two cards are amazing in the deck on their own, together they're just going to lock out your opponents. Keep that in mind if you don't want to win that way, by your opponent's scooping afterwards, that is. As for the deck's own interaction, it's running artifact-based removal in the form of Angel of the Ruins, Duplicant, Meteor Golem, and Spine of Ishsa. Obviously, the glaring issue with these cards is their casting cost along with the fact that they're not instants. But that's okay because 1. The deck is running plenty of ways to reduce the casting cost of artifacts, and 2. There are a couple of ways of giving them flash anyways. But most importantly, being artifacts means being copied by Urza, Prince of Kroog. So we can continuously blow up anything we want if we're able to copy them. Do be wary when going infinite though, since you might be tempted to create infinitely many copies of Spine of Ishsa, thus blowing up absolutely every permanent your opponents control, including lands. This could give you the win via scooping, but do so at your own risk because the salt might be high. While the first two are more restrictive in what they can get rid of, they're exiling their targets, making them slightly better in that sense. Scope for efficacy is a good trade-off in this case. Canoptek Scarab Swarm is another artifact-based exile interaction, only it exiles a graveyard. On its own, that's nothing to scoff at since graveyard decks are quite powerful. Very few players run Graveyard Hate in their decks. While this is the only one, being an artifact means being tutorable with Inventor's Sphere and reusable via copying thanks to Urza. As a bonus, we're also getting 1/1 flying artifact creatures when we do exile graveyards. That's more fuel for our win cons as well. This card is amazing here. Granted, overloading Cyclonic Rift is still one of the best things you can do in a blue deck in terms of interaction. In this deck possibly more so, since we want to clear the way for our artifact creature army to get through and smash face. Speaking of, Cyberdrive Awakener is another way to get that done. While Akoma's Memorial is giving all of our creatures keyword soup, this gives all of our artifact creatures flying as a static ability as well. However, when it enters the battlefield, it turns all of our non-creature artifacts into 4/4s. While Urza's copies become 1/1 creatures, the deck still has plenty of non-creature artifacts that can be turned into beaters as well, especially since Urza gives them +2/+2, so this thing does some work. However, it only lasts until end of turn. However, to a hapless opponent swinging into us, we can activate Urza to copy Cyberdrive Awakener in response to blocks in order to animate our non-creature artifacts and use any untapped ones to block for that pro-gamer move. The deck is still running things like Ancient Den, Seed of the Cyanid, Darksteel Citadel, and Razortide Bridge. It's for artifact lands to make the most of this effect. While in most cases it's risky to run artifact lands, these help the deck out so much in so many ways that they're definitely worth including here. In any case, the last two are inherently indestructible, so animating them or copying them with Urza is still a great thing to do, if nothing else. Same with Draconian Gatebot. So far this is the only artifact that opens attractions when it enters the battlefield. While this might seem pretty random, it's a great way to increase the deck's artifact count beyond the Commander format's deck size limit. We do care about how many artifacts we control after all. Granted, we are creating indefinitely many more artifacts thanks to copying them with Urza, so the deck's size restriction is moot anyways. But if we're copying Draconian Gatebot, we're getting an extra artifact with each time in the form of an attraction. These attractions can then be copied themselves, animated with Cyberdrive Awakener, fed to Krark Clan Ironworks, boost Bronze Guardian and the deck's other beaters like Nettlecyst, Kappa Cannoneer, and the Construct tokens, etc. Think of it as another Anointed Procession in terms of getting 2 artifacts per activation. As for the attractions included, we want quantity over quality, so all 22 legal attractions are included. Since visiting them is a bonus, we can still be as effective as we can. 11 of them will trigger on a 2 or a 5, while the other 11 will trigger either on a 4 or a 4 and a 5, with all of them obviously triggering on a 6. While none of them will trigger on a 1, none of them will also not trigger on a 3. However, with how the lights are distributed on all of the printed attractions, I have found this ratio to be good enough if you want to trigger as many attractions as possible at once when you roll to visit them. For more info on how to maximize attractions, you can check out my Mirror the Magnificent deck tech video in the link above. However, if you are going this route, make sure you include Urza's Dark Cannonball in your sticker board, since Costume Shop lets you put a sticker on a Land permanent when you visit it. Unfortunately, it doesn't give tickets, so you can't put ability stickers on your cards. But putting the Urza's name sticker on a card with either Urza or Urza's already in its name is quite cheeky. It's a shame that Riveting Rigor is silver bordered and thus illegal in Commander. If opening attractions is black bordered, then so should assembling contraptions. But I digress. In any case, if it were legal in Commander, then this is yet another artifact creature like Draconian Gatebot, in that copying it would be like getting 2 artifacts for the price of 1. Granted, in order to assemble the contraption, you'd have to sacrifice another artifact when it enters the battlefield, so your net amount of artifacts would only increase by 1. But it'd still get you 2 +1/+1 counters and you'd still assemble a contraption. And there are 44 legal contraptions you can include, which is twice as many as attractions. Can't include them all because Sapsucker has a green color identity. Besides interaction or beaters, other key artifacts to copy are those that draw us cards or gain us some form of card advantage. We already saw Coveted Jewel and the Mightstone and Weakstone, but those obviously aren't the only ones. The deck's running Thought Monitor and Sicarian Infiltrator. These draw us cards when entering the battlefield, so copying them when our hand is emptying is quite useful. Thought Monitor will almost never cost more than 1 blue to cast. Sicarian Infiltrator having Squad means that we can pay 2 generic each time in order to create that many token copies of it. Tokens that will also draw us a card when entering the battlefield. Since Squad is an additional cost just like Multi-Kicker, this will also be reduced with the deck's cost reduction effects, so we can potentially quote-unquote pay for multiple squad costs without really paying any mana at all. So good. Plus it also has Flash, which is amazing. Sullen Simulacrum also draws us a card but when it dies. However, it ramps us a basic land when entering the battlefield. So copying this multiple times with Urza can help us get all of our basic lands from our library right onto the battlefield if we wanted to. And as for drawing cards, we can always chump block with those tokens or sacrifice them to Krark Clan Ironworks. Arcanist Owl and Fairy Mechanist don't draw us cards per se when entering the battlefield, but they do have us look at the top cards of our library. We can then reveal an artifact or enchantment thanks to the Owl with them and put it into our hand, bottom decking the rest in a random order. While drawing cards is always better, these creatures being artifacts is what makes them so good. We can copy them with Urza if we wanted to keep digging through our deck for any key artifacts or for Anointed Procession thanks to Arcanist Owl. The synergy is strong with these. Badakin Archmage and Cadaptic Spider draws cards synergistically as well, but with the former doing so whenever we cast an artifact spell, and the latter whenever a non-token artifact creature enters the battlefield under our control. While it won't trigger off of Urza creating soldier tokens, it'll still trigger off of all the artifact creatures in the deck. Plus, we can also copy it with Urza. That way, whenever a non-token artifact creature enters the battlefield under our control, we'll draw a card for each copy of Canoptic Spider we have. So good. That being said, Shimmer Dragon is the best synergistic card draw effect in the deck. Not only is it a 5/6 flyer that will almost always have hexproof, but we can tap down 2 untapped artifacts we control to draw a card. Since this is an activated ability on the dragon, it doesn't matter if those artifacts have summoning sickness. With the amount of artifacts already in the deck, plus the amount of artifact tokens we can create on top of the number of attractions we can potentially open, this dragon will help us draw into a ton of cards in this deck. It's insane. Even more so than the non-synergistic card drawing instance in the deck like Drawn in Dreams, Stroke of Genius, and Sphinx's Revelation. These are still amazing because they're amazing mana sinks that we can cast at the beginning of an opponent's end step to potentially draw into a ton of cards. So they're great at recovering from a board wipe or when we're in grindy matchups. Plus, Sphinx's Revelation gives us X life as a bonus, but they still pale in comparison to Shimmer Dragon. Lastly, the final 3 artifacts to copy with Urza are Sculptor's Skill, Imposter Mech, and Glasspool Mimic. Don't worry, I'm well aware that Glasspool Mimic is not an artifact creature. However, since its backside is a mana generating land, it doesn't take up a slot in the deck, so long as you're not greedy. Play it as a land if you need it as a land. But the reason it's here, along with these 2 artifact clones, is that it can enter the battlefield as a copy of any other artifact creature we already control. especially if we need copies and we don't have Urza for whatever reason. Even for copying something like Crypto Thrall in order to give each other hexproof, as previously mentioned. Or a Canoptic Spider for further value. It's just too good not to include, especially since it's free real estate in the deck. As for the first two, absolutely amazing. Sculpting Seal can copy any artifact on the battlefield, so we can use it to copy any of our opponent's amazing artifacts and then further copy it with Urza. Same with Imposter Mech. We can use it to copy any creature our opponents control, but it's still an artifact when it does. In fact, it's still a vehicle. That means we can continue copying with Urza, and much better since it'll survive wrath effects that only trigger creatures. So imagine copying an opponent's Seedborn Muse or other busted utility creature, or an opponent's creature with an epic enter the battlefield trigger, only to copy it multiple times with Urza, just to flex your superiority. Flavor-wise, I'm pretty sure that's well within Urza's personality to do. The rest of the deck is just the rest of the lands. The deck's running all 7 fetch lands, Hallowed Fountain, Prairie Stream, Irrigated Farmland, Glacial Floodplain, Idyllic Beachfront, Command Tower, Ancient Tomb, and Shrine of the Forsaken Gods, as well as 4 of each basic land. As with all of my deck techs, you can build your mana base according to your budget. Whether you include more expensive cards or even cheaper cards is up to you. You do you. This brew is just an idea of how to build around Urza Prince of Kroog. While you can build Urza however you want to, since there are literally 2,071 artifacts you can consider for this deck. So the sky's really the limit with how you want to build it. That being said, I decided to make the most of his abilities without going too far into high-powered territory. I mean, I am running attractions after all. And if I could include Riveting Rigor, I would have as well. If you're interested in the deck list of this spicy brew of mine, you can find a link to it down in the description. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. I'd also like to thank anyone using my TCG Player affiliate link. That also helps out the channel. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of the Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am the Bearded Kirby, and happy brewing.